Hello, everyone, and welcome. Today I'm going to share two deeply unsettling stories that culminate in truly shocking conclusions. I promise you. The twists in both these narratives are absolutely worth sticking around for. But before we plunge into the darkness of these tales, if you find yourself fascinated by the strange, the grim, and the mysterious presented in a gripping storytelling format, then you've definitely arrived at the right channel. This is the only type of content we focus on. So if that sounds like it's up your alley, please do me a favor. Remove the batteries from the remote control for the like button's TV. Then, once they are completely out, take some strong super glue and seal the back cover shut. Also, be sure to hit that subscribe button and turn on all notifications so you don't miss our weekly uploads. Alright, let's dive into today's stories. On the night of May 3rd, 1897, 43-year-old widow Mary Titus was lying in her bed within her home in the small town of Plymouth, Pennsylvania. Mary simply could not fall asleep. She was kept awake by a strange, insistent tapping sound emanating from somewhere inside the house. Eventually, Mary gave up trying to sleep. She sat up and listened intently, trying to pinpoint the source of the noise. It was maddeningly elusive. The tapping was erratic, seeming to come from all over. One moment it felt like it was right beneath her. The next it was across the room. It was difficult to determine its origin, let alone what was causing it. Furthermore, the volume kept shifting. Sometimes it would be quite loud. Then it would fade to a barely audible whisper, but it was always there. Then, just as suddenly and inexplicably as it began, the tapping abruptly ceased. Mary remained sitting up in bed. It was deep into the night, perhaps 2 or 3 a.m., and the house was utterly silent. At that point, Mary tried to rationalize. Okay, it must have been an animal, or perhaps a tree branch hitting the side of the house. She told herself it was harmless, and that she should stop worrying and go back to sleep. But shortly after she laid her head back down, just as she was drifting off, the sound started again. And once again, she could not tell where it was coming from. Mary, though a widow, did not live alone. She shared the house with her 18-year-old daughter, Cora. Cora's father and Mary's husband had been tragically killed 11 years earlier in a terrible mining explosion. Even after a decade, Mary and Cora were still consumed by the grief of his passing. It was a shadow they had never truly escaped. As Mary lay there, listening to the renewed tapping, part of her wondered if Cora was perhaps up doing something. But mostly the sound brought back a profound feeling of loneliness and an intense longing for her husband. She desperately wished he were there so she could tell him, "You go investigate. I'll stay here. Make sure we're safe." But he was gone. Finally, though Mary was deeply reluctant and frankly scared to get up and confront the sound, she thought of Cora downstairs. What if there was a real problem, like an animal that had gotten in? She felt obligated to be the brave one, find the source and ensure her daughter's safety. Also, Cora was still recovering, not yet 100%, from a severe bout of strep throat. Mary convinced herself this was an opportunity to check on her daughter. Gathering her courage, Mary threw off her covers and climbed out of bed. As she did so, the tapping sound seemed to echo and bounce around the house frantically. But the very instant Mary's feet touched the floor, the tapping stopped. Mary began walking toward the door. Silence. She reached the door, opened it, and listened intently. Nothing. The house was completely silent. There was something eerily deliberate about it, as if the sound were reacting to her movements. Mary's courage instantly evaporated. She decided the sound has stopped. Everything must be fine. Cora is surely okay. She rushed back to her bed. Neglecting to check on Cora, she pulled the covers up to her chin and simply hoped the sound would not return. It didn't, and Mary eventually fell into a deep sleep. The next morning, Mary woke up, took stock, and realized she was fine and the house seemed normal. She listened, heard no knocking, and quickly got dressed. She went downstairs to the kitchen, where Cora was already sitting, seemingly perfectly fine, though still weak from recovering from strep throat. She was in good spirits doing some needlework. Mary breathed a massive sigh of relief. She still had no idea what that tapping was. It could have been totally innocent, but there was an undeniable unease about it. It was simply a comfort to have life feel completely normal again. Mary quickly fell into her daily routine, beginning to prepare food for herself and Cora. They started chatting like any normal mother and daughter. At no point did Mary mention the tapping. She was spooked by it and didn't want to frighten Cora. It was during this completely normal morning chat that a very clear and fairly loud tapping began. It wasn't in the kitchen, but beneath it, in the cellar. Mary froze instantly. She recognized it as the exact same sound that had so badly spooked her the night before. Without saying a word, she looked at Cora to see if she had heard it too. Cora was looking back at her mother with wide eyes. "You heard that too?" Mary asked. "You heard that tapping?" Cora replied. "Yes, I think it's coming from the cellar," Mary confided. "I could have sworn I heard that tapping last night. It actually kept me awake." Cora offered a logical suggestion. "Well, since it sounds like it's in the cellar, maybe we have mice down there rummaging around. That's probably it." Desperate for a non-frightening explanation, Mary immediately went down the stairs into the cellar, determined to find mice to prove that was all it was. But when she got down there and searched, there were no mice and no signs of mice activity. As she stood there, she heard the tapping again, but now it wasn't coming from the cellar. It was coming from somewhere above her. The moment Mary heard the tapping, she heard Cora's startled reaction upstairs in the kitchen. Mary bolted back up the stairs. She saw Cora visibly distressed. "I heard it. It was right here in the kitchen or nearby. I didn't see anything, but I heard it the moment you went down there." At this point, Mary was undeniably terrified. Whatever this was, she could no longer deny that something bizarre was happening in her house. Her daughter had now fully confirmed it. Mary declared, "I'm going next door." They had a neighbor, a friend who used to work with Mary's late husband and acted as a sort of handyman for them. Mary went over, knocked on his door, and when he appeared, she frantically explained the knocking sounds. "It's terrifying me and Cora. We can't figure out what it is. Can you please come take a look?" He immediately agreed. Mary returned home. She and Cora were standing in the kitchen, occasionally hearing the tapping. Soon after, the neighbor arrived. As he stepped inside, he too began to hear the tapping. "What is that?" Mary cried while Cora was clearly spooked. The man confidently stated, "I think it's your pipes. It sounds exactly like your pipes banging against the wood inside the walls. Let me check your plumbing. That's most likely the cause." Mary and Cora felt a glimmer of relief seeing his confidence. They hovered nearby as the neighbor began checking the plumbing in the kitchen and the bathroom. But as he examined the pipes, fittings, and potential sources of the strange tapping, he realized the sound persisted, and it wasn't coming from the plumbing. Sometimes it seemed near the pipes, but at other times while he was working in one area, the tapping would come from the other side of the house. Mary and Cora started to sense that the neighbor, who had arrived so confident, was growing uneasy. He looked troubled, as if something felt fundamentally wrong. Then out of nowhere, when the tapping became very loud and it was now obvious to all three that it couldn't possibly be the plumbing, it was nowhere near them. The man turned around. His face was ashen. He looked deeply distraught. He said, "The last time I heard that sound was in the mine. It was when your husband was killed in the explosion. He died, but other men were trapped behind the rubble. They couldn't get out, and they kept tapping on the rocks over and over again until they died." He added, "That's what this sounds like." After delivering that horrifying pronouncement, the man simply got up and hastily left, telling them, "I'm sorry. I can't help you." He was out the door and back to his own house. Mary and Cora were left in utter shock and confusion. Who could they turn to? What was happening? For Mary, despite her anger at the neighbor for telling her such a terrible thing, he knew she was grieving her husband, she began to think about his words. What if these were ghosts? What if it was her husband and the other minors, trying to get her attention and communicate with her after all these years? Over the next 4 days, the tapping continued inside their house, and the story spread across the entire town. Neighbors and even newspaper reporters flocked to Mary and Cora's home to witness the tapping for themselves. Mary would walk them around, and sure enough, the reporters and neighbors would all hear the unexplained phenomenon. By this point, Mary and Cora were entirely convinced that the sounds were their dead husband and father communicating from the mind. Finally, on May 9th, 6 days after the haunting began, the story was everywhere, legitimizing their plight. Yet, they still had no solution. Mary and Cora sat at the kitchen table, weighing their options. Even if this was her dead husband trying to communicate, they couldn't live with the terror. Would they eventually have to move? As they were discussing this, the tapping started again, but now it was so incredibly close, practically right on top of them. Their conversation stopped immediately. They looked at each other, realizing the intimacy of the sound. The tapping seemed to be directly beneath them, almost in the cellar right underneath their seats. Mary reflexively leaned back in her chair, trying to pull away from the immediate sound bubble. As she sat back, she saw something she had never noticed before. Instantly, she understood exactly what was going on. It turned out the tapping sounds that had plagued Mary and Cora were not being caused by Mary's dead husband or the men who perished in the mines 11 years ago. However, the actual origin of these tapping sounds was, in some ways, equally as bizarre. Cora had recently suffered from a bad case of strep throat. While she was recovering, the bacteria responsible for strep throat remained in her system. That same bacteria is also responsible for causing a condition known as Sydenham's Chorea, which Cora had unknowingly contracted, likely around the same time as her strep throat. Sydenham's Chorea, often called St. Vitus dance, or the dancing plague, causes a person to experience involuntary movements that they are often completely unaware of. People with this condition can exhibit sudden flailing or twitching movements without conscious knowledge. The reality was this: Cora was making the tapping sound, but she had absolutely no idea. It was an involuntary symptom of the chorea. Why hadn't Mary noticed her own daughter tapping her foot or flicking her hand? When the tapping first started, Mary was often not in the same room, and Cora truly didn't know she was making the noise, so she was just as genuinely frightened. Combined, they immediately jumped to the conclusion of a haunting. Then, they developed what was essentially tunnel vision, as did the neighbors and reporters. Everyone wanted it to be a ghost story, so nobody considered the obvious explanation of Cora's physical movements. But finally, when they were sitting at the table, discussing their fate, and the tapping began with such intense closeness, Mary leaned back to survey the room and noticed it. Cora's foot was unconsciously stomping rhythmically on the ground under the table. Cora had been the source of the terror for 6 days. One afternoon in November 2021, a middle-aged woman named Nicole Patty was on break at her job in Decatur, Alabama. She pulled out her phone and called her 21-year-old daughter, Hannah. Hannah answered, and Nicole could immediately tell her daughter was still feeling awful. She could hear it in her voice. Hannah was a stay-at-home mother to 2 very young children, which was exhausting on its own. Nicole could hear the sound of the children yelling and running around in the background, pure chaos. But Nicole knew Hannah wasn't just tired from parenting. For the past couple of months, every time Nicole spoke to her daughter, Hannah sounded completely under the weather. She constantly complained of deep exhaustion, dizziness, and intense nausea. Over those months, Nicole had persistently urged her daughter, "You have to see a doctor. This is not normal. This is not just parenting fatigue. Something is wrong." But Hannah, who was known to be very tough and rarely visited the doctor, insisted, "I'm fine, Mom. I'm just exhausted from the kids. It's nothing serious." So this time, Nicole knew pushing her wouldn't work. Instead, she asked, "Okay, Hannah, when is Brian coming home?" Brian was Hannah's husband. Hannah sighed. I don't know when he'll be here. Brian was a very successful chiropractor. His private practice was so successful that he had recently been able to fully renovate his building. With the new space and extra staff, he was working even more than usual. This was financially great, but meant he was basically absent all the time. It had become common for Hannah to be alone with the kids and her mysterious illness. Nicole understood the situation. Brian's practice was important to the family. Instead of being upset with him, Nicole had tried hard to be available for her daughter, offering to care for the kids and help whenever possible. But Nicole also worked full-time, limiting her availability. For the next few minutes, Nicole and Hannah simply chatted. Towards the end of the call, Nicole once again offered, "Hey, I really think you should go to the doctor. If you tell me the day and make an appointment, I will come over and take care of your kids. I'll even take you to the appointment. I'll flex my schedule to fit yours. Don't let logistics stop you." But as always, Hannah brushed her mother off. "Okay, maybe I'll go. I don't know, but I think I'll be fine. I'm going to rest, take my vitamins, eat well, and I'm sure this will pass." Nicole sighed. Realizing her daughter was still refusing to go, she simply told Hannah she loved her, and they hung up. Over the next few weeks, Hannah continued to feel absolutely awful. Her nausea, dizziness, and exhaustion persisted and even worsened. Yet, despite the pressure, she refused to see a doctor. She was convinced this was just exhaustion that she needed to grit out, very much her personality. But finally, in January 2022, after months of symptoms, Hannah could no longer argue with reality. She was literally falling apart. She had lost so much weight that she couldn't walk around the house anymore, relying on a desk chair to wheel herself from room to room. She was undeniably severely sick. Finally, Hannah said, "Okay, Mom, I'll go to the hospital." Nicole was incredibly relieved, but also immensely frustrated that her daughter hadn't gone sooner. "Regardless," Nicole told her, "Great. I'll come over, pick you up, and take you. I'll be with you." When Nicole arrived, Hannah wheeled herself to the door. She looked horrific. She weighed less than 100 pounds, 45 kilos, was severely pale and looked like her hair was falling out. She looked critically ill. Nicole helped her daughter into the car, bringing the kids along too, and drove to the hospital. Hannah was soon brought into an exam room. A nurse checked her vitals, asked questions, and weighed her. The nurse told Hannah, "You only weigh 84 pounds, 38 kg. This is far below a healthy weight. This is an emergency. Based on the symptoms you've described over the past few months, I'm worried you might actually have stomach cancer." Even though Nicole had anticipated something serious, hearing that her 21-year-old daughter might have cancer hit her like a punch. Hannah, too, was horrified. She still believed whatever this was would just pass. A doctor entered and explained that the next step was testing for stomach cancer. He admitted it could be something else, but given the symptoms and extreme weight loss, stomach cancer seemed unfortunately likely. They would have an answer in a few days. Shocked and scared, Nicole and Hannah agreed to proceed with testing. A few days later, Nicole was home when her phone rang. It was Hannah. Nicole assumed this was the call, with the cancer results, and answered with immense anxiety. However, Hannah wasn't calling about the tests. Her voice was so low Nicole could barely hear her, but she croaked out that she felt so sick she needed to be rushed to the hospital immediately. Nicole dropped everything and sped to her daughter's house. Hannah could barely move, so fatigued, so sick, so pale, and so malnourished. Nicole scooped her up and raced her to the hospital. Later that day, Hannah was stabilized in a hospital room. When she arrived, she was showing signs of acute respiratory failure. Her lungs were shutting down. One doctor told Nicole that had she not rushed Hannah to the hospital that day, she likely would not have survived another 24 hours at home. With Hannah stable, doctors tried to figure out what was happening. One doctor pulled Nicole aside and said, "Look, we are testing her for stomach cancer, but acute respiratory failure is not connected to it. Plus, it is incredibly rare for someone as young as Hannah. We really don't know what's going on." All we can do is keep her stable, monitor her, and run more tests. Nicole agreed to everything. For a few days, the medical staff did just that. They monitored Hannah while testing to find out how someone her age could contract respiratory failure. But after a few days, Hannah suddenly suffered a severe seizure. Following the seizure, medical staff investigated Hannah's brain. They discovered she had also contracted viral meningitis, inflammation of the membrane surrounding the brain. While viral meningitis is usually not life-threatening, in Hannah's case it was severe, and combined with her other serious issues, doctors worried she could die or suffer severe brain damage if they didn't urgently combat the swelling. A decision was made to place Hannah in a medically induced coma so she would remain perfectly still, allowing the swelling in her brain to subside. This meant Hannah would be in a coma indefinitely. Just a couple of days after Hannah was placed in the coma, some of her imaging tests came back, specifically scans of her abdomen. What they discovered inside her abdomen was truly shocking. Hannah's entire digestive tract was covered in white spots. The doctors knew immediately those spots were not cancer. They were something worse. After running a few more tests to confirm their theory, they called the police. Remember Hannah's husband Brian, the successful chiropractor? His success had allowed him to fully renovate his office and build a bigger practice. One of the upgrades Brian insisted on was an X-ray room. X-ray rooms are typically lined with sheets of lead to contain radiation. Lead is incredibly toxic to humans, especially if ingested. When the police investigated, they found that after the renovations, several extra sheets of lead were left out in the open. They discovered that someone had been meticulously shaving off small pieces of these extra lead sheets and planting them inside Hannah's vitamins, the very ones she took religiously believing they would make her healthy. She was literally poisoning herself. And the person shaving the lead and attempting to kill Hannah, her own husband Brian. Those white spots in Hannah's digestive tract were literal pools of accumulated lead. Her husband had been methodically poisoning her to death for months. Miraculously, Hannah survived. After nearly 2 months in a medically induced coma, she recovered sufficiently to be woken up and returned home to her children. Brian was arrested, found guilty of attempted murder, and sentenced to life in prison. His motive was the $1.3 million in life insurance policies he had secretly taken out on Hannah. If these stories captivated you, make sure to like and subscribe to our channel. Tell us in the comments which story's ending shocked you the most. Watch this video I highly recommend next. Until next time, take care.